All right, good morning, everyone. It might appear for today, moving forward, that I'm going faster. And I'm not going faster. I'm just choosing not to go as slow as I have been going so that you could kind of catch up to my speed and how I teach. Remember, you could always rewatch the videos. I have old lectures that use different analogies on the pelvic girdle stuff. But what we can't do, and I'm not saying you're doing it, I'm just generally speaking, we can't come to expect that the only time we practice this stuff is Monday, Wednesday, Friday at 7:30. You have to go out on your own and practice this stuff so that we can move on to bigger and better things. I guess for some people you might be bitter, but not you guys, because y'all are here at 7:30. So we're gonna start off with cervical, and then we'll do some application for cervical and trunk, and this will be the last day that I'm taking time to go over this stuff because we got to move to scapula, shoulder, elbow, radial, joint, and wrist before your test. Okay. So again, please practice on your own and come see me if you have any questions. So one of the things you hear me keep talking about is illusions and not using global references for locally referenced concepts. So in other words, when we're looking at the cervical vertebra, functionally, we're looking at making you look at things or keeping you looking at things. That's the whole point of moving our neck, is to get us to possibly look at things. It looks like it's moving, and it is. Or keeping us looking at something maybe when our body is trying to get us to not look at it. Okay. So those are the two biggest things. One of the traps is that if we are taught, well, this is how the neck moves to get us to look at things. When you look to your right, it's because of right transverse cervical. Or if you look up, it's because of extension. The trap that goes into is being able to look up and not moving your cervical vertebra at all, or being able to look down and not moving your cervical vertebra at all, being able to look to the right and not moving your cervical. Gorillas can't move their neck. They got but just because they look to the right and the left doesn't mean the motion happened here, right? So that's why we have to look at landmarks. We have to look at locally referenced bones and landmarks so that we can better see when we have deviations of our neck. How many of you are familiar with motion capture? It's done like in video games a lot, used in biomechanics, where you put the little markers on people and you record them, and you can see how the little reflective markers move. So visually, to me, the easiest way to kind of look at landmarks are, things, keep it simple, things we know. We know ears, we know shoulders, we know hips, okay? So we have kind of this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 marker system that we can reference. So in other words, if my right ear gets closer to my right shoulder, these two markers got closer together. But in this case, these two markers didn't get closer together, so I might have appeared to have the same motion, but there was no movement of my neck, of my cervical. Sagittally, a good landmark is chin to chest. Literally, I told you last week, we go sternum to pelvis or pubis. All we're doing is moving up one level. Chin to chest is a good landmark, a good practical local landmark for sagittal. Chin gets closer to chest, we got more in the fetal. Chin got further away from chest, we got further away from feet. But chin could stay the same distance from chest, and we can look down, or we can look up, and I didn't move my neck at all. Didn't move my cervical at all. Does that make sense? So it doesn't have anything to do with the room. Doesn't have anything to do with up, down, left, right, front, back. It has everything to do with these locally referenced systems. So sagittal, chin gets closer to chest, get me in the fetal, cervical flexion. Extension, getting further away from fetal, chin goes away from chest. Right and left lateral, instead of going shoulders and hips, we're just going ears and shoulders. Right lateral cervical bending, left lateral cervical bending. Looks like it's moving, and it is. Right lateral from, left lateral to, left lateral from, right lateral to. Okay. It looks like it might be moving, but it's not. If I do something like this, So in other words, if you learn it where when my head goes to the side, my head can go to the side and I don't necessarily have to move my neck. Right? Transverse. And maybe Lindsay has a different reference system. I love to use chin to chest sagittally and chin to chest transverse. Good references. When your chin is lined up with your with your sternum, with your chest, you're rotationally, they're lined up. You're an anatomical. What I mean by that is I could be flexed but not be rotated. We kind of did that with the knee, right? My knee can be flexed, but rotationally I'm still in that plane's anatomical. So chin to chest, a good landmark, good reference, local reference for rotation. When my chin is to the right side of my chest, I'm right transverse rotated. And when my chin is to the left side of my chest, my sternum, I'm left transverse rotated. Right transverse to, right transverse from, left transverse to, left transverse from. If I do something like this, globally, you say, whoa, chest spun to the left. Absolutely. But isn't my chin now to the right of my sternum? Right transverse rotate. To the right. Spun to the left. Those two motions have to be called the same thing if they get you to the same place. Driving to Breaux Bridge has to be considered traveling east, regardless of if you stay put and the world spun and brought Breaux Bridge to you. You still have to travel east. So this is right transverse. This is right transverse. This is left transverse. This is left transverse because it gets me to the same place. This is flexion. This is flexion. This is extension. This is extension. This is right lateral. This is right lateral. This is left lateral. This is left lateral. Get it? Where it gets, and it doesn't have to be tricky if you practice, but where it gets tricky is we have a lot of, our Etch-a-Sketch has a lot of different knobs that we can use. So we never know when we're going to use them. You could have trunk rotation and not have any pelvic girdle rotation and also have cervical rotation. Trunk is literally moving and bringing the sternum from right to left. The cervical is moving, in this case, keeping my eyes fixed on what I'm trying to look at. In other words, if the cervical went along for the ride, it was, so you're going to have to be able to see. Was it just the pelvis moving about the trunk? Was it the trunk moving about the cervical and the cervical maintaining my eye position? Those are the things that we're going to have to assess. And I'm going to teach you, I'm going to give you the clues to be able to do that. Okay. They don't always work in opposition. I think I mentioned this last week. Sometimes you may want to rotate your trunk and your neck in the same direction, but there's a practical reason to do so. If I'm trying to look behind me, my trunk can help reposition my eyes, only so much. And then my head can reposition my eyes more. My hips can help me reposition my eyes more. But all of that motion didn't come from my neck. That's why we analyze things joint by joint. Okay? So, cervical vertebrae, same verbiage. That's what I love about it. All I got to do is just change trunk to cervical. We have the same verbiage. Sagittal, we have flexion, extension, frontal, right and left lateral bending. See a little prop. Okay. It looks like it's moving, and it is. Cervical flexion, cervical extension, flexion from, extension to, extension from, flexion to. Flexion from, extension to, extension from, flexion to. Hyper is excessive, beyond normal. Okay. right lateral bending from, left lateral bending to, left lateral from, right lateral to. Think about it. If this was flexion, extension, and then hyperextension, is this right lateral, hyper left lateral? Exactly. Right? Transverse, right transverse cervical from, left transverse to, left transverse from, right transverse to, right transverse from, left to, left from. Okay. Any questions before we get into some pelvis, trunk, cervical examples? Lindsay, anything you want to add? Is that your landmarks you use? All right, let's do some practice. So this is going to be some open-ended questions. Did the pelvic girdle rotate? If so, how? What did it rotate? What spun the basketball? Did my trunk have motion? If so, what was it? Did my cervical have motion? If so, what was it? So think of it in layers. Every question, now, not every question is going to be yes, some of it may be no. There was no motion in the cervical, there was no motion in the trunk. So we want to talk about pelvic girdle, potentially hip or hips, trunk, and cervical. Okay. All right, question number one. What if we started off like this? Start. Finish. Go. Do me a favor. Float around during these, just, and she won't tell you the answer, but she can help clarify maybe landmarks or what to look for. So then you kind of float around. Feel free to pull her over if you have a clarification. God, that's that are very confident. You know where. So yeah. Yeah. So what we're working towards with practice, and the more you practice, the better you're going to get at this. But what we're working towards is when you guys are in the field, when you guys are in the clinic, when you guys are in the ring, on the mat, there is no, excuse me, athlete, can you replay that time that you just got injured? It's my point that you're going to have to eventually replay it in your mind. Eventually, it'll get to the point where you will be able to replay it so that you could see the mechanism of injury or the mechanism of form improvement. So that's what we're working towards. All right, you guys, did the pelvic girdle rotate? Good. How? Right. Right transverse, right? Right transverse, right? I hate the word that right is right. We're going to the left, right? No, right, the left. Dang it. Who's on first? Right transverse pelvic girdle rotation because of hip or trunk? Hips. What did my right hip do? Internal. Left hip external. Let's look at a before and after. Hey, right hip, where are you at? My right hip's like, dude, I'm internally rotated right now. How can I prove it? Hey, right hip, how would you have to rotate to go back to your anatomical? The right hip says I'd have to externally rotate if I'm going to line back up. Therefore, I had to internally rotate when I left. And remember, the illusion is you're learning things from the small piece moving about the big piece. But the same motion can happen when the big piece moves about the small piece in the opposite global direction. That's the cap and bottle concept that I try to explain. Okay? So right transverse pelvic girdle because of right hip internal and left hip external. Good. Did my trunk have significant obvious motion? No. Still lined up. My chest, my sternum, and my pubis both went in the same way. There was no deviation between those two pieces. That would be like saying, did the bottle open? If both the cap and the bottle moved the same, there was no deviation. There was no change between the two segments, right? Did my cervical vertebra have motion? Yes. How? Left transverse cervical rotation. Good. My chin went from being lined up to being deviated to the left side, to the left of my sternum. If my cervical didn't move, this is what would have happened. But it had to rotate to my left to keep my eyes fixed on something called a functional circle of sight. Being able to keep your eyes fixed on something even though your body might be moving, or repositioning your eyes to look behind you when your neck can't do it all by itself. Okay? Any follow-up questions to that first one?
I like to think like so if if you need to find significant motion in the pelvic girdle, you're trying to see if there is questions are is there pelvic girdle motion, and then how did the pelvic girdle back motion uh, it can be based on which part of the body is on the ground, which is the closed circuit. So if my feet or my hips are on the ground, it's because of my hips. So my pelvic girdle is rotating because of my hips. But if my trunk is on the ground and my pelvic girdle had rotation motion, it would be because of my trunk. That's what I wanted to add.
Yeah. So what the point Lindsay's bringing up, and I'm just saying it in a different way because different people get different analogy, is that until your hips move the basketball, your basketball ain't going anywhere. In other words, I can move my trunk. I can move my trunk until my hips spin the basketball. Basketball's not going anywhere because my feet are fixed on the floor. That makes the hips anchored. When you're off the ground, as we're going to do some examples now, your feet are off the ground, so I can do my hips all I want. Basketball ain't going anywhere until I palm it, until my trunk moves my basketball. All right, let's get to, Lindsay, would you mind cutting those two? How is the trunk rotated? Position. Remember, position is where you're at, and motion is where you're going. So let's analyze trunk position based off of the clues that we have. You don't have to see someone go somewhere to know where they are at when you know the reference. Reference is anatomical. You didn't have to see this person move to know where his trunk is at. Does that make sense? So let's try to analyze where is the trunk rotated? How is it rotated? Let's see if I could get some better visuals up here. Lindsay, that was a good segue because my next one was going to be on the ground. Trying to just get a better picture. Okay, his trunk rotated too, and remember when I say the, it's really his. You do it hers. It's just when I say the, it's not a global reference, it's a local reference to the person. His trunk rotated to the right or to the left. Okay. How do we, and this is the fun part, you're correct. But it's how do we know that that's what I like to consider next level teaching. I don't want you to guess, I want you to know. Like I want you to be able to, if you were in kinesiology court, or if you were talking to another peer or heck, even to a professor, and they're like, well, how do you know it's twisted to the right? What would you tell them? How do you know? Because what? Yeah. Uh-huh. Yeah. And when his sternum is lined up with his pubis, he's not rotated at all. Remember how it was like if chin is to the right or chin is to the left, we could do the same game with the sternum and the pubis. What hip is his sternum looking at? His right hip. And the only way to get your sternum to look at your right hip is to twist your trunk to the right this way or twist your trunk to the right that way. Still get you to the same place. I know that his trunk is twisted to the right because his sternum is literally looking at his right hip. And the only way that can happen is either this way or this way. Does that make sense? Now, to get to that position, if he started with his shoulders, flat on the ground, his pelvis is going to rotate. But that's the pelvis's perspective. The pelvis can spin. The pelvis doesn't translate to the same as the trunk. They're two separate entities. So to get into that new position, his pelvis spun to the left. That's why we communicate. What did the pelvis do? But his trunk spun to the right. Again, the analogy is if you were going to open up the bottle, you either have to spin the cap lefty-loosey or the bottle righty-loosey. Both of them will open the bottle. Motion is open. Whether you spin one part this way or the other part the other way, they get to the same end. Before we analyze, let's talk. Most questions on the test, true. I try to rearrange it to go left to right. But sometimes Google makes us have to go the other way. Let's look for clues. They have a machine similar to this in the weight room if you ever want to play around with it. And the concept is we're going to keep our upper extremity fixed and we're going to be able to rotate our pelvis. Thus, we're using muscles of our trunk, right? Okay. We're not using hip muscles, we're using trunk muscles. The clues of the weight stack tells us where the person got into the machine, where they started. They got into the machine with the picture on the right. I know that because all the plates are stacked together. Right? That's where you start. Now, or at least from the context clues, you can reposition that bottom to choose whether you want to start twisted or whether you want to start not twisted, whether you want to start twisted the other way. You have choice. But for this example, the choice was made for us. This person is started in a twisted position. I'm not going to tell you what it is because I want you to practice and figure it out. But Do you see how his trunk is not anatomical in terms of transverse plane? Yeah. So based off of clues, we need to figure out what position did his trunk start in on that picture on the right. Don't answer. Consider it. Then the person goes from this start position to being lined up. There had to be motion that went from being this position to now being in a new position. Okay? So this is advancing Lindsay's point. What I would like for you to analyze is, did the pelvic girdle rotate? Spoilers, yes. What spun the pelvis? Well, in this case, it wasn't hips. The hips are kind of fixed in. They're just going along for You spun the pelvis because of trunk motion. Does that make sense? Your trunk, I gave you the analogy, it's like palming the basketball when your trunk is spinning the basketball. So let's see if we can, yourself, with the native, I always encourage conversation. That's how you practice studying. Let's see if we could figure out pelvic girdle rotations in substitute trunk motion from right to left. And again, the only reason I'm doing right to left is because right is the start position when you get into the exercise. And the left is where you would move the plates when you do that first repetition. And you bring it back, right. Or you can keep going. Lindsay, would you say this is one of the more challenging, like if you can get, I mean, I know there's some radiological stuff too, if you could get the pelvic girdle to trunk concept, that's kind of. What's great about the trunk is that there's only one of it. You don't have to worry about because of the right hip, left hip, both hips, and the right hip and left hip. Just one. So it should make it easier. Remember, right and left mean two different things when you have one something or appendicular. Right and left for appendicular literally means my right or my left. For the trunk, it means to the right or to the left. Not be able to see a sternum, but we know where it's at. Right? It's in between his shoulders. What hip is his sternum looking at on the picture on the left? His left. Good. His sternum is looking at his left hip. Can everybody see that? So that means his trunk has to be twisted to his left. Those are our clues. His trunk is left transverse rotated. It has to be twisted to the left because that's the only way to get your sternum to look more at your left side. Whether it's bringing the sternum to look at the left or bringing the left to look at the sternum gets to the same place. Are we good with our starting position? His trunk is twisted to his left. On the picture on the other side, literally on the left, well, now his sternum's not deviated to either side. It's right down the middle. So how do we change those positions? How in the world can you go from being twisted to your left to not being twisted at all? You have to have right transverse trunk rotation. Does that make sense? That's the only way. Unless I'm possessed, I'm not going this way to go all the way around. Be a bad day. I had to go this way. Now, it's not traditional. It didn't look like it looked like this. Start, finish. From here to here is the same movement as from here to there. And that's what's happening. His pelvis is rotating because of his trunk rotating it. The muscles of his trunk and the final test, we'll get into muscles. Right now, though, before we get into muscles, it's kind of hard to talk about muscles influencing motion through the variables of contraction when we can't even get the motions right. And that's what we're here. That's why we're here, working on the motions, because if we can't even get the motions, it doesn't even matter if we add more variables. Okay? Does everybody see how we got to that answer? We use the clues, guys. We don't guess. We try not to guess. We try to, what did Deadpool say? An educated wish? Yeah. We try to minimize our educated wishes. All right, let's do some of these. I think that word means what you think it means. Princess Bride, anybody? All right, guys. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to start in the middle. Okay? In the middle, the trunk is not rotated in terms of transverse in the middle because the sternum is lined up with the pubis, right? So I'm not saying the trunk couldn't be deviated sagittally. I'm not disrespecting sagittal. It's just I want to have a transverse conversation for the application of these questions, right? So starting in the middle, there is no deviation. Let's go legs to the left, shoulders stay on the ground. So again, if all you've ever been taught is the trunk rotates when my shoulders move, this is going to mess with you because we can rotate the trunk without our shoulders going anywhere if the other side moves. So legs to the left, I want to know pelvic girdle rotation and trunk motion. Legs back up and to the right, pelvic girdle rotation, trunk motion. To the left, to the right. So we're going to analyze those motions, starting with legs to the left side, then to the right side, then to the left side, to the right side. We'll do it enough to where hopefully you can see it and it makes sense. Guys, use your, that's why I give them to you. Sternum relative to pubis or sternum relative to hips. That works too. What hip is the sternum looking at? What hip is the sternum deviated to? Those are good clues to help us see what's happening at the trunk and the pelvis. Go. Start with left. Deviate to the left. Right. To the left. Just gonna say it. And I'll, obviously, any questions, clarifications, starting in the middle. Going to the left transverse pelvic girdle rotation, right transverse trunk rotation from anatomical. Coming back up, right transverse pelvic girdle rotation, left transverse trunk rotation to anatomical. Continuing on to the right transverse pelvic girdle rotation, left transverse trunk rotation from anatomical. Coming back up from the right, left transverse pelvic girdle rotation, right transverse trunk rotation to anatomical. You see how those things are working in opposition? Because they have to. If both the trunk and the pelvis rotated the same, it's only one day. I'm not getting better. If both of them rotated the same, this is what would happen. They have to work in opposition. Make sense? That one day I'm not getting back up. Today, oh, it's not that day. Lindsay, can you think of another good pelvic girdle, trunk, cervical example? Maybe I could do a swing. Which one was that?
This one. This one. Motion this.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah. I'm good.
Yeah. That one got me nervous.
All right, good job, guys. So let's analyze, and again, guys, what's cool about human motion doesn't care about your sport or interest because we all have the same component pieces. It's just how we apply it. What I mean by that is I could analyze hockey, not the sport, not like the techniques, not the strategy, but human movement. Because they're humans and their stuff moves the same way as baseball player stuff and football player stuff and gymnast stuff and volleyball player stuff. The joints and the motions are the same language. Okay. So in other words, it doesn't matter if you've never played baseball. We're looking for clues. So let's assume somebody, so he's a right-handed batter. Let's assume he's keeping his head on the ball, keeping his head level as he goes through the swing. His head does not move, but that does not mean we didn't have neck motion. That's the biggest thing I think I'm trying to get you guys to take away from. Just because we didn't see the head move doesn't mean he didn't have motion at the neck. Does that make sense? So let's see if we can analyze cervical motion based off of the clues in the picture going from left to right. Okay? The question of me asking you to analyze cervical doesn't disrespect other things happening. We could have those conversations. But we analyze joint by joint, and I gave you a joint for us to analyze. So by me asking you to look at the cervical, I'm not saying that there's not other stuff happening. We can totally talk about those things as well. But you keep it simple. You analyze motion joint by joint. So that way it doesn't get overwhelming. How many of you, and you don't have to answer, no, y'all shut. But I hope that some of you have started watching sports, TV, when you work out, like just, it opens up a new, it opens up a whole new realm of hopefully curiosity to how people move. And I mean, it's not creepy at all. Just pop some popcorn, go in the gym and just watch people, Order Uber, have them deliver it in the weight room. That's not normal. You're studying. All right, you guys. If you are a process person and you just love process, remember the steps of process stay the same. The application can be infinite. Ask yourself, yes or no. Start with a yes or no. You got a 50-50 chance. Did the cervical move? Yes. And if the answer is yes, well, then you just have a follow-up. How? Right? Well, let me analyze my position. Where is my cervical vertebra? Okay. Well, it's already twisted to my right. But if you look at the picture all the way to the right, it's twisted forward. That's like saying that I'm in Breaux Bridge, I'm east of Lafayette, but in the next picture, I'm in Henderson. I'm even further east. So therefore, I had to travel east. Does that make sense? So here's an example where my cervical is right transverse rotated, but in the last picture, it's even more right transverse rotated. So I had to have right transverse rotation to get me further down that road. Make sense? There's a picture that I'm probably going to use on the test. I'm probably going to use it on the test. Where they literally have someone who started and they're looking at their left shoulder. And the last picture, they're looking at their right shoulder. And every year, people try to tell me that the neck didn't move. Every year. And it's no disrespect to them outside of they didn't watch the videos and they didn't literally listen to me say, guys, I'm going to ask this question. And we can't use, well, the head didn't move, so my neck didn't move. Does that make sense? If my neck didn't move, this is what it would look like as you swung the bat. Hey, I'm still looking at my left shoulder. My neck had to rotate so that I can keep my eyes fixed where I want my eyes to be fixed at. Does that make sense? That's why on the board for your first test, I was like, answer the question like I taught you how to answer. No tricks, no fools. I'm telling you, I'm literally playing poker with my cards out. You see my hand. It's whether you choose to want to take advantage of that info or not. Okay? All right, let's have a pelvic girdle conversation. Left or right transverse pelvic? Outstanding. Mostly, I probably wouldn't use this picture. Mostly that left transverse pelvic is going to be because of left hip internal. The right leg is going to kind of serve as a kickstand. It's going to kind of go along for the ride because the most efficient way to spin your body is through one fixed point, not in between two. Think about it. If during the Winter Olympics, when you see figure skaters that are spinning real fast, they're not spinning around both legs. They pick one, they spin real fast. So advanced hitters are trying to rotate their whole body about one fixed point because it's more efficient to spin your body around one point. Okay? So the non-lead leg literally just becomes a kickstand. Now the trunk for, again, I'm not talking about little leaguers that might swing like this, but for baseball, the trunk really isn't going to start to rotate until you make contact, and then there's going to be like some left transverse to slow you down. The trunk really goes on. You don't have time, in other words. What I mean by that is when the pitch is coming, you don't have time to do this, then this, like, so your trunk kind of goes along for the ride with the pelvis. And there's clues for that. If this box stays lined up, then you know that that motion had to come because of pelvic and hip, and the trunk was just going along for the ride. Make sense? Clues. Look for the clues. Let's see if I can get a couple more in here. You guys like practice? Awesome. All right, how about we do this? Let's do some practice. We're going to go left to right for all of them for consistency. 3 separate questions. A sagittal. Top left is a sagittal question. Top right is a transverse question. Bottom is a frontal question. I will say this. Sometimes students will confuse the start picture for the question. What I mean by that is some students will look at that first picture, and if I'm asking, how did you move, right, from this reference to that reference, some students will look at the first picture and answer it just with the first picture as the whole reference. In other words, some students will look at that first picture at the bottom and say left lateral cervical bending. When that's a position, the next picture is another position. How did you have to move, change positions? And on the test, you'll attest, I always do start finish when I'm doing motion, right? Start finish, start finish, start finish. So be mindful of that when you practice, that the first picture is a reference position. The next one is another reference position, and the motion is how did you have to change position. Cervical flexion. Does that make sense? She started off in an extended position. She ended in a flexed position. The only way to get there is to have flexion. All right, what about top? I don't assume. If you give me clues, I'm going to take clues. The position that she starts with, her chin is looking at her left shoulder. So she's twisted to her left to start. She's rotated to her left to start. Now her chin's looking at her right shoulder. She's rotated to her right to start. The only way from going to be left rotated to right rotated is to have right transverse cervical rotation. That's how I do it, because it's so easy to confuse rights and lefts and ups and downs. And utilize the clues that we're given. On the bottom, she starts off left ear close to the left shoulder, so she's laterally bent to her left. Next picture, she's laterally bent to her right. So she had to have right lateral. Now the whole trip, right lateral to anatomical, right lateral from anatomical. Lateral to, left lateral from, right lateral to, right lateral from. That's why it was so important that we emphasize the difference between position and motion, right? Because position is a huge clue. Where are you at? Where did you go? How did you have to move to get there? All right, guys, utilize those old videos. I'm telling you, man, I have some with some pumpkins during the time frame that shall not be named. I use some pumpkins to help show pelvic girdle rotation. I must have 12 different videos of pelvic girdle rotation that's there. Utilize them. And on Wednesday, we're getting into upper extremity stuff. Choo-choo!